In this video, we are going to begin the creation of our menu system. Up until now, we've been putting together a screen system, and we've already got a main screen to demonstrate things like screen initialization, backgrounds, and so forth. What we need to do at this point is set up actual menus, where in our game a menu is simply a list of items that can be selected to invoke something else, like another screen or jumping into the game.
Now, is this menu going to be an object that is placed on a screen, or is it a specific type of screen object itself?
It's going to be a specific type of screen. As a matter of fact, it's going to inherit from screen.
Okay.
Since we would like to be able to plug this class in, this menu class in, anywhere that a normal screen could go.
All right.
Now, what we're going to do in this video specifically is we're going to set up the menu architecture. Even though this is going to be a very simple architecture, there are things that all menus will have in common. Things like the fact that they will have selectable items on them, and those items need to be drawn with a specific color, and so forth. So this class we're about to put together is simply all of the common things found in a menu, and then all further menu classes can inherit from this one. Now, before we get started, I do want to clean up our workspace just a little bit. So let me grab Screen Main. I'll right-click on it and close all but this. And that'll simply pull down the amount of open documents we have. Now let's jump in and create this new menu class. Let me first collapse up the content folder, and then we can get a better view of all of our code files. So what we'll do is we have already started a folder here under our project called Menus. We've already got the main menu inside of it. Even though technically at this point the main menu isn't really a menu yet. But underneath menus, we'll go ahead and make the base menu class. So we'll add a new class, and we will call this class Screen Menu. And as soon as we get the Screen Menu class loaded up, we'll jump in and do our standard operations of cleaning up the subnamespace and adding in some using statements. As a matter of fact, well, we've still got the Screen Main class open, so I'll just steal the using statements from here, because we'll be looking at both XNA.framework and XNA.framework.graphics.
Something less to type.
Now we can move into the class itself with Screen Menu. Of course, it is itself a screen, so it will extend from screen. And we are also going to mark the class as abstract, because while the menu class is going to be able to handle things like selectable items, it's not going to have any actual items added to it.
Okay.
So therefore, there would be no need to ever instantiate a base screen menu class. Now we can jump into the screen menu class and take a look at its fields. The two pieces of data that a menu is going to need to manage are all of the items held within the screen itself and which one of those items is currently selected. So we'll make two fields here. Both these fields are going to be protected so that any descending class, any other menu we create, will have access to them. So beginning with the first, will be protected. And what we're going to do is, since we're going to have the list of items, we'll make that the list of items as a string list. And in order to store which item is selected, we'll store a selection index as an integer. So we'll drop down the selection index first. Protected int selection index. Now again, for the actual items, we're simply going to store strings, just so we can see the name of any given item. So we'll make another protected field, this time a list of type string. We'll call this list item names. And since we need to instantiate the list before use, we will do that here with the field initializer. And that will get our item names list set up. So again, relatively simple data that we're storing, but again, this is just something that we'll need in any screen that we might create. So it all gets dropped here in the main screen menu class. Now we need to move on to some functionality. There's a handful of methods we need to override from screen itself in order to give some menu-specific functionality, and we will also create a brand new virtual method inside of screen menu to handle the individual drawing of items. But we'll get to draw towards the end here. The first thing that we want to do is put in an override to process show. And we'll take out the call to base. Since we're descending directly from screen, we know that the base process show doesn't really do anything. So we'll drop that down. The reason that we are overriding process show here is to simply reset the selection index, to make sure that anytime a menu comes up for view, it resets its selection so that the first item is selected.
Okay. So if you don't like jump around to screens, you don't end up like halfway through a list.
Exactly.
Which could be a really long list, potentially. You could have maybe hundreds of songs you've loaded in here.
And this will generally make menu navigation more predictable. If you get used to always seeing the first item as the one selected,
Gotcha.
you don't have to worry about trying to adapt to what state you left the menu in last time. All right, moving on from here, and just as a side note, we're going to do the skeleton approach. We'll put all these methods down, and then we'll turn around in a second pass and code them in. So moving on from process show, the next thing we're going to do is to override the screen's input pressed method. And inside of input pressed, we will again remove the call to base.inputPressed. And the reason for looking in input pressed is we will take any up or down button presses and make sure that they modify our selection index appropriately so that we see the selection move up or down based on the direction we pressed.
Okay.
All right, moving on from here, we're going to make a new method here. We're going to make a brand new virtual method that's going to be called drawMenuItem. So just to briefly drop this in place, we will have public virtual void drawMenuItem. And drawMenuItem is going to take in a handful of parameters. We're going to have a sprite batch to use when drawing. We'll call this parameter sprite batch. We will have an integer which describes the item in question, the item that needs to be drawn in this call. So we'll make an integer item index. And finally, we will pass in a color with which to draw the item. We'll call this parameter simply color. Now the purpose of drawMenuItem is, since we already know that we're going to need to manage a list of items, we're going to design the screen menu class to, from the base class, actually loop through all of our items in its own draw call, and every time it sees an item, it will in turn call drawMenuItem. Now we're not actually going to implement drawMenuItem here in the base menu screen, since there are going to be no items within this class to draw.
Okay.
But the idea is that this is the class we'll be looking to override when we go to design real menus.
Sure.
And this simply simplifies a few things for us. One, we don't have to write a list transversing loop every single time we create a screen, and any type of color lookup, for example, seeing whether we're using the selection color or the normal color,
Right.
that'll simply get passed into us, so there'll be fewer things to solve at this point.
Very nice.
One thing I might do just to indicate, since we've got kind of a convention going where any virtual method that we don't implement immediately, we're placing the braces off to the right of the method, just as a quick visual indicator that this exists, but it's meant to be used and overridden later.
Sure, because usually if we're going to put some sort of functionality in there, we put it within the lower braces.
So, moving on from here, we have one more method that will need to be addressed inside of screen menu, and that is the actual draw method, where we will override draw coming in from screen itself. And in this one, we will leave our call to base.draw in place. Once again, we've got background drawing taking place in the base screen class, so we want to make sure that that gets handled appropriately. Now we can turn our attention to the actual implementations of these methods. So, back to the top here in process show. Again, this one's very simple. It's just going to make sure that our selection index gets reset. And since we've already got that field established, all we'll do is look for this dot selection index and set it to 0. So that way, whatever the first item is as listed will be selected. Now, inside of input pressed, we need to look for the up or down button, and then modify the selection index. So let's begin with the up input. We'll make an if statement that's going to check the incoming input data and see if the named input is equal to named inputs dot up. And if that is indeed the case, what we'll do is we'll take our selection index and we will actually decrement it. Because the idea is that, let's say we had the last menu item, which for example may be index 4. If we wanted to move up on the screen, we'd have to decrement that, because 0 is always going to be the topmost element. So to get closer to the topmost element, we will decrement.
Okay.
Now we do need to prevent this index from going negative, otherwise we'll run into problems when we try to access the elements inside of the list. So we'll accomplish this with a simple if statement. We'll look at this dot selection index, and if it is less than 0, then we'll simply set it to whatever the bottommost item is.
So now we're wrapping.
Exactly. Rather than just stopping the navigation by hitting the topmost item, we'll allow the whole selection to wrap around. This will be useful on things like the song selection screen, where you may have many songs, and it's more convenient to access the last song by simply wrapping the top.
Sure.
Instead of having to always navigate from one end to the other. So if we've reached the top, then we'll set the selection index to the bottom, where bottom is simply grabbing the number of items that we have minus 1, which would look like this dot selection index equal to item names dot count. Of course, this list is 0 based, so we'll take 1 away from this count number. For example, a 3 item or a number of items of 3 would give us 0, 1, and 2. So 3 itself is not useful, and therefore we'll decrement. And just to make this a little bit more specific, we'll add our this reference before the selection index when we're decrementing it. So that takes care of what happens when we navigate up. Now we can put an else if in place to check and see whether or not down was pressed. So once again, we'll look into input data and see if the pressed named input is equal to named inputs dot down. And if we are moving down, we'll go the other direction with our selection index. So this dot selection index plus plus will increment it. And once again, if we navigate off the bottom of the list, we'd like the selection to wrap around to the top. And this is a little bit more simplistic here, because we can simply take the selection index and modulus it against the overall number of items. So if we go an item too high, then we'll wrap back around to 0. And we can do that by using selection index modulus equals item names dot count.
Cool.
So that takes care of input, and now we need to handle the drawing of items. So down here inside of the draw method, we'll jump down right after our call to base.draw, and we'll put together a loop so we can walk through all of our items. We'll drop in a for loop and hit tab twice to bring up the for loop template. We'll use I for our variable, and we will loop over all of the items. So this dot item names dot count. And then for each item, the main thing that we need to do is put together a call to draw menu item. Draw menu item is going to be expecting a color, so we need to figure out what color we're going to be sending in before we make the draw menu item call. So we'll make a color variable here. We'll call this variable color, and we'll set that by default to be equal to style colors dot text normal. Now, if this item that we're currently looking at as we're looping through all the items happens to be the selected item, then we instead want to pass in the color of text selected. So we need to run a check and see if, basically looking through the items index by index, where index is stored in I. So if I is ever equal to the selection index, that means item I is the selected item.
Right.
So we could say if this dot selected index is equal to I, then color will actually be equal to style colors dot text selected. So, now that we've got a color established, we know we can satisfy this part of draw menu item. We need to specify which index the item is. We've got that stored in I, and the sprite batch will simply be passed on from the call to draw itself. So now we've got everything we need to do to make the draw menu item call.
So it's just time to draw it.
So we'll simply make that call, draw menu item, passing in the sprite batch that was passed to us, passing in I for the item index,
And then the color.
Color for the color parameter.
Very nice.
Now, with all of that put together, I'm not seeing any errors in IntelliSense. I'll build one time just to make sure. Everything has succeeded, so that has our menu base class assembled.
Now, there's nothing we can really test at this point.
Right, we don't have anything. Again, the base one itself is abstract and doesn't have anything to draw anyway. So at this point, there's no way to see a result from this.
Okay.
In the next video, we'll put together our first class that utilizes the menu system.
Awesome. Well, let's get on to the next video.